Hi, my name's Steve Shepherd, and I'm going to talk to you today about how to make the most of your chances when doing the video cases for TUE. So we're going to go through a few bits. Firstly, a bit about the different options and a bit about what they're looking for, and then finally a section on how to be consistent in your reports. So there are two main options. The American logbook doesn't require a submission of any video cases. So essentially, this is really talking about the European and the British. So the EACVI is one of the most popular. It asks for 6 cases. These have to be anonymized, but you are allowed to report age and sex. And they ask for the perioperative stream, not the cardiology stream, the perioperative stream, 4 specific types plus 2 of your choice. And they have to include a CABG, aortic and mitral valve surgery, and major aortic surgery. The last 2 are completely up to you. You can decide to do anything that you want. And similarly, you need to supply images which are relevant to the case. For the other 4 that are dictated, there is a minimum number of images which have to be supplied. If you supply more than this, they won't be looked at. But for instance, you have to supply something demonstrating left ventricular dimensions for the coronary artery bypass grafting, for instance. These are all available on the website. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but make sure that you know what you need to submit when you're collecting your cases. The BSc is a bit different, so they want 5 cases and they have to be completely anonymised, so no age and no sex. They ask for 3 specific types, so a normal study, aortic stenosis and mitral regurg, and then 2 from the list on the screen. The BSc requires that you submit all images from a minimum data set, and it makes no distinction between cardiology and perioperative. So you require a significantly large number of pictures. They need to be submitted using a PowerPoint, unlike the EACVI, which has its own specific piece of software, which is web-based. What are they looking for? Well, largely they're looking for the same kind of thing. The images that you submit should be of high quality. Don't use studies that are incomplete, even if you're doing European. You will inevitably find, in my experience, that you'll have missed something. So please use a study that is complete and study that you can go back to and make any further measurements on, which I'll show you a bit later on. Try not to use people who are poorly echogenic, just because it's a really interesting case. It's just that if the images are poor, it's not the thing to submit for your extra case for the ACVI, for example. As a minimum, each loop needs to have 1 to 2 complete beats. The BSc guidance is that you should use 1 beat for a normal image, and if there's any pathology, then your clip should have 2 beats. My advice to you is to submit a minimum of 2 beats for each one. Make sure those beats are as expected for the patient, for example. So don't sample after ectopics. Don't sample a non-paste and then a paste beat. So they have to be comparable because those things change the filling status, which affects how you report. And try and avoid doing times of hemodynamic instability. So in the immediate post-bypass period, taking these whilst other things are happening can mean that you are frustrated later when you come back to them after that really interesting case. There are a number of kind of relatively easy wins, I think, so about image optimization. So image optimization is key to a lot of this, and you should try and do this for every case, I think, but particularly for the video cases. I hope it goes without saying that you need to have the ECG on, so that needs to be clearly visible and it needs to have minimum interference when you're submitting them so that people are able to see where you're timing from. But really think about these 3 things, depth, gain and focus, because they'll make a large difference. So these are transthoracic images, but I hope they still convey the point, which is that here the depth is set too high. So you can see at the top there's the left ventricle. You can see that it's pretty much in the near field. There's not very much in the far field, and similarly you're wasting a lot of your echo clarity. If you reduce the depth, you get a much better image. You're able to more clearly see the structures of the left heart, but more importantly, you're able to measure them, which is key, because it's much easier to measure things which are bigger than with things that are smaller. Gain, again, you want to make sure the gain is correct. This is obviously undergained, but suddenly this is obviously overgained. And if you are using a picture where it is too gained, what you'll see is, again, if you're looking in the chamber here, so the left ventricle, which is here, you should not see speckling or any quote-unquote echogenicity, because that shows that this is overdone. And similarly, you don't really want to kind of present that as a way of getting over someone's poor echo windows, which we know we do. Last thing is focus. So you can see here the focus is set too much in the near field. You've got a really great view of the right ventricular anterior wall, but your distance view, again, if you compare this bit, if you look at the mitral, this is much less helpful. You set the focus more appropriately in the distance. This has got its sharpened back, but similarly, it's appropriate for the thing that you're actually trying to image. There are a couple of no-nos, so don't do this. Don't move the probe while you're sampling and then submit it. You should have a structure that is not moving because of manipulation of the probe or of respiratory movement if you can. I appreciate that's not always possible, but something like this, don't do. And similarly, again, we've all done this, whether you've clipped too quickly. And it's really important to try and work out what your machine is going to do when you press image store. So they each do things slightly separately. So for instance, the Philips shaves the next 2 beats and the GE saves the beats that were there before. So one's antegrade, one's retrograde. So you just have to be clear as to what you are expecting to happen when you press that button. All of them have a button on them marked accept prior to store. Or something similar to that. And essentially what that does is it shows you a little preview of the thing that it's going to save, so you can decide whether you want to save it or not. And that's actually really helpful because it means that you waste less time and get less frustrated when you're coming back to report. But also when you're doing your video cases, you can also select the beats that you want. So if you've had an ectopic beat, you can select the ones that are before or coming later, for instance. You can also, on most of the machines, change the number of beats that you want to save pretty easily from the interface that go into the menu. So you can save a longer run for whatever it is that you're wanting to sample. This is the other thing. So here, the actual image is pretty reasonable, but this is in the field. So it records where you've put the cursor. So you need to move that out of the way in order to be, if you submit that as a video case, it will be noted and commented upon. And the last thing is when you're taking measurements, submit a picture or a still of the thing where you've taken the measurements. So if you've measured a dimension and you haven't saved the measurements that you have made as a separate image, it's impossible for the person looking, and I say this in theatre, it's not impossible, it's very difficult for the person looking to go back and be sure that where you have measured is actually right, because you need, as you can see here, you're able to interrogate kind of leading edge to leading edge. You're able to check that you're in the right frame at the right part of the cardiac cycle. So if you don't save that picture, it's just your word for it. And in real life as well in the video cases, it's important to be able to have the images justify your measurements. For a number of things that are particularly relevant when you're thinking about the Dopplers. So first of all, you need to focus your signal to the area of interest. And that means having good 2D images, and particularly for pulse wave, having your sample box in the right place. Optimize the scale to get the best height for the signal, which I'll show you a bit more, and make sure the sweep speed is appropriate the scale is appropriate at 40 to 60 unless it's an atrial septum. And really importantly, make sure you set the sweep speed at 75 to 100. So this is the accepted standard for presentation, and you should send more clips at that sweep speed rather than sending a shorter sweep speed and be able to get more information, particularly where the rhythm is unstable. So if it's AF, you need to take a lot of clips. Your reports will be more accurate if you have something to average. And for AF, that means averaging at least 5 beats. So you need to make sure that you have the appropriate number of images stored and measurements. And as I said, as with your 2D, include the measurement. So don't just present the Doppler image without the line on showing that it is the E to A ratio of XYZ, for instance. Try and avoid interference. I'll show you some examples. And as I've said, make sure you know if it will save antegrade or retrograde. So this is an example of a colour box. The scale is too high, as you'll see. So this is the intra-atrial septum, so it should be significantly lower this, 20 to 30. There's nothing wrong with side to side, colour versus non-colour, but you do lose a lot of resolution from the 2D image if you do this. So for many things that's fine, but just bear that in mind, depending upon the echogenicity and distance of the thing that you're trying to sample. But this is a pretty reasonable choice of size of colour box. You know, it's not sampling anything that it shouldn't. If there is any regurgent flow, you could be relatively confident that it was hitting towards the end. If we look at this, however, this colour box is too big. So this colour box is sampling into the anterior septum when we are actually mainly interested in the tricuspid. So this would be better off being brought down to here. Your colour box needs to be over the area of interest, and it needs to extend sufficiently back into the downstream chamber that if there is any regurgitation that you'll see it. You can see here as well, there's interference from the aortic valve. So you're getting this artifact here. So that is, again, not an image that would be suitable for a video case. Another example. So again, the issue with this one is that it's not really over the area of interest. So I'm unclear as to what this person was trying to sample in the main, because actually there's regurgitation of both valves. So if you are interested in the aortic valve, I think you're better off putting your colour box here, like so. And similarly for the mitral, you would then have a second colour box, because again, you can see here there's regurgitation, but it's moving outside of the colour box. And so therefore you don't know how far it extends back into the left atrium. And so whilst it's sufficient for the aortic, it's not sufficient for the mitral. It's also a bit off axis compared to the rest, as I said. And similarly, if you look here, your focus is in the far field. So actually you'd need to have your focus further up towards the mitral in order to make this the best image. I think this is pretty reasonable. So here your colour box is mainly in the over the edge of interest. There's a little bit of extension to the atrial septum, but that's fine. It covers the whole area of interest throughout the cardiac cycle, and again, it's at an appropriate scale. Thinking about scale for Dopplers, so here we have an appropriate sampling point, but the problem is that actually, if you're going to try and measure this, this would be quite problematic, and that actually if you reduce the scale and brought the baseline down, you have something that was much more easily measured. For example, like this. So here you can see that the scale has been appropriately sized to the window. You can see the baseline has been brought up, and importantly, this is what I mean when we say you've got the measurement. And when you're measuring signals, particularly continuous wave signals, the guidance is chin, not beard. So if you imagine this as a chin, you'd want to sample the thing that's the most dense section rather than the wispy-ish bit towards the end where it's less well defined. Again, this is another example of having the scale at the appropriate point. It's also got the variance on, which is fine if you want to submit, but does make the images a little bit more busy and is not actually required as a minimum standard. Interference on your signaling can also present like this. So these beats are all right, but this one you've got some dropout, which again is clinically you sampled the other beats, so fine, but actually if you're going to submit that as an image would be less acceptable. Similarly, something like this, where you've got a lot of interference and a lot of dropout, wouldn't be reasonable. Whereas this, where you've got a nice clear demarcation, you can see where you're sampling. This is a good example of how to do a pulse wave Doppler. What are they looking for in terms of reports? Well, the reports are judged on both their completeness and their accuracy. So the questions are really, does the report match the uploaded images? And that absolutely has to be the case. So if you have reported something as severe aortic stenosis and the image that you have presented of the continuous raised aortic valve is of low velocity, those things are incongruent. So you need to make sure that those things match before you submit. Are there any areas of interpretation or omission? So again, if you are presenting for the BSc video cases and you haven't included a measurement of the, let's say, left atrial dimensions, or you haven't measured it and you've said visually appears, that's not really kosher. And all of the reports have to include a summary that can be understood by a non-echocardiographer. And that's absolutely easy marks. So I'll show you how you get marked later on, but you have to be clear that this isn't just for cardiologists and cardiac anesthetists. So a non-echo person needs to be able to understand what you say. There is obviously a lot of pragmatism. So if you say something, please say how you decided it. So if you say that the ejection fraction is good, or that there is good function and it's visual, that's fine. Just say that it was visual. If you report the ejection fraction as poor, but you don't say the Simpsons was X or visually appears poor, then again that doesn't tie in. The other examples are, for example, ventricular dimensions. So if you say that the ventricular dimensions are dilated, have a measurement in the report, either in the data at the end or as part of that statement, which is backing that up. So the things are congruent. If you can't see something, don't make it up. So the classic example is the Simpsons. So we all know that on a 4-chamber you get a lot of natural dropout, and it's not always easy to be able to measure or to be able to define the endocardium at that area. So that means that you can't easily do a Simpsons. That's okay, because you often have a good enough images to be able to say the function is X, Y, Z visually. But don't report a Simpsons if your imaging is not good enough for you to be able to do that. And again, if you can't measure something, you can infer, but say that's what you're doing. So for example, if you are unable to get alignment of the aortic valve in a deep transgastric view sufficient to measure the gradient, it is appropriate and possible to say visually valve appears normal and no 2D suggestions of restricted opening, which is consistent with no aortic stenosis. That is fine, maybe not for your aortic stenosis case, but that is fine because you're using the correct interpretation of your images. And you can just make a comment that you were unable to measure the gradient across it because of poor Doppler alignment. That's fine. There are, again, some easy wins. Please be systematic. So write something about every chamber and every structure. If you can measure something, please measure it. And as I've said before, make sure that they are the same on the pictures and on the report. Another thing is that make sure your interpretation correlates with the right guideline. So this causes ructions not infrequently when people show me their video cases. And I think this is best summarized by something like this. So this is what every relevant scientific society or clinical society would consider a normal ejection fraction. And as you can see, there are significant differences between, for example, the European Society of Imaging and the BSc. A 3% difference in your ejection fraction isn't clinically relevant, but if you report an ejection fraction of 52, as normal, and to the BSc, they will mark you as wrong because that's not what they say. So just have those things in front of you and be clear about what you are reporting. Be also aware that there are significant institutional differences in how things are reported. For example, here at Barts, when the physiologists are reporting left atrial dimensions, they report using the American values. And the reason for that is that they differ. So the British reporting system uses a gender matched values for left atrium, which are different. And the reason that we do the American or values, which are bigger, so if you are a American sonographer, your atria of your patients are bigger. They're not actually, but it's because we do a lot of cardiomyopathy work, and a lot of the evidence for cardiomyopathy for things like ICD, primary prevention, is based on left atrial dimensions, and it's based upon North American populations. So just beware that there are things like that around, and make sure that when you are reporting, you don't just slavishly use measurements that might have been done elsewhere in your institution. Go have the guidance in front of you, the most recent for each reporting system, and go through it. EchoCalc makes it really easy for the BSc because it's updated the whole time. EACVI, all of their most recent guidelines is available on the website. What are the minimum images? So I think these are going to be relatively comprehensive. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you need to have all of the mid-esophageal views from 0 to 120 degrees. You've got to have the transgastric views, all three, measurements for the pulmonary artery and aorta, and essentially your septal thickness and left atrial dimensions. You need to put some colour over the aortic, the mitral, and the tricuspid valves, and there are a number of Doppler measurements, which are principally pulmonary veins, mitral valve, aortic, and tricuspid if there's TR. There are a number of things that you have to report. So you have to measure some chamber dimensions for everyone, so particularly the left ventricle. So that means measuring in diastole and systole the left ventricular internal dimensions, all thicknesses at left atrial diameter in at least 50% is the request. And then your additional reporting data, it depends upon the pathology. So you would need to report LVOT VTIs or gradients across the aorta for your aortic case, but maybe not if you can make a statement, as I said previously, for the non-aortic case. For each structure, use descriptive terms. So you need to describe what it looks like. You can describe how it functions. You need to just make some measurements to that story, and then you need to have some interpretation. Okay, so always structure, function, interpretation. How you judged? Well, we all want to be good, right? So that means you need to be clear and well laid out. You've got to have conclusions which are appropriate to the presented data and which are comprehensible to both cardiologists and non-cardiologists. And similarly, if you're poor, it may be serious or error-filled. Substandard errors or omissions, and that is enough to get asked to resubmit. So try and think about this, clinically useful, it's descriptive, it's related to the data, and it's related to the information on the request. Happy to take questions. Again, hopefully that has covered most of it, but I think in summary, be thorough of your examination, be critical of your images, and be consistent in your measurements. And then be really detailed in your reporting. Make sure you check it before it goes off. Thank you.